There's lots of different pre-hire candidate assessment tools on the marketplace right now. Companies can assess a person's cognitive skills, emotional intelligence, just plain old intelligence, personality traits, and the list goes on. How do you know what kind of test you should use for the category of jobs or even a specific job title? Today, we're going to be discussing 3 different types of assessment models. First, we'll cover a 16 personality factor model, then jump into the Holland code or a RACIC model, and then we'll spend some time on a 5-factor model. Will these models help you put the right person in the right job? Or in other words, the right butt in the right seat? Or are they just a complete waste of time? All right, let's get started right now. Today's guest is from Bryq. Bryq provides a scientifically validated pre-hire assessment tool that promises to remove bias from the recruiting process and increase hire diversity. Their assessments measure both cognitive skills and psychometric traits, which help match candidate characteristics with job requirements. My guest is the CEO and co-founder of Bryq. Please welcome Markellos Diorinos.
It's a pleasure to be here, Jeff.
Thanks for coming here. So we're going to jump right into the deep end. Markellos, tell me a little bit about what Bryq does and how you got into psychometric and other kinds of assessments there.
No. And by that, I mean, let me tell you a bit about how I got here, right?
Okay, yeah.
So I've had the opportunity to work in 3 different continents. Well, I don't know if it counts as 2. I worked in the US for a while. That was like 5 to 7 years. I worked in Latin America. I've worked in Europe. I've worked in Africa and in Asia. Man, that is 5 continents. Well, okay, 4 for the Americas. And what I realized as a common denominator is that wherever I worked, the only thing that made a difference in my company's performance was talent. At the same time, what I figured out is that, man, it's hard to find talent, right? This is the problem. And I've done probably a few hundred interviews during my lifetime, trying to find people who would not only be able to do the jobs, they would bring the skills, but they would actually be a very good fit for what we're doing as a company at the given time, right?
Right.
And that hasn't been easy. And too many failed interviews, too many people who shouldn't have made it down the line. When we looked at that, we said, man, there has to be a better way, right? We can't be wasting our time on candidates that are not right. We can't be losing candidates just because no one knows who's going to be a good fit, right? I'm sure there are a billion people out there who could do the job, but how do I find the right ones? And this is how we started thinking about Bryq, right? And the whole excursion started with, there must be a tool out there. And we found a bunch of tools. Actually, one would say there are too many tools out there that can help you hire, right? But they're always giving you a piece of the picture. So there are a bunch of really nice psychometric tools, right, about personality. And then you have skill tools, and then you have cognitive tools. But there was none out there that would give us the big picture, right, and would help us process fast, in volume, and correctly. So this is how we started to do Bryq. And we looked at what is the best indicator for future job performance. And you know that most of the time people do hire for what? Experience. Have you done this job before? Turns out that experience is actually the worst indicator for future job performance, right?
Go figure, right?
People don't necessarily change jobs to do what they've been doing before, right? They change because they want to use their talent, because they want to do something else, because they want to utilize their full potential. So how can you read that in the resume? The resumes themselves are a big problem of what we have today, because how accurate are they? The answer is little to none at all, right? Did you know that 87% of employers think that the resumes contain inaccuracies and lies? How can you trust something where, the overwhelming majority thinks is what's the politically correct term? Is inaccurate, let me put it that way, right? You can't. Yet people take the resume, they start off of that, and they make decisions based on that. And they know it's dirty data. They know that the resumes are bad. So we stopped there and we said, man, we can do this better. So let's start by getting clean data. And you can only get clean data from the source. The source here is the candidate. So instead of asking the candidate, let's go and assess the candidate. Let's assess him for what counts and get pure, clean information from the candidate that we can use and rely on. So we've set up this assessment and we looked at what's really important for future job performance, right? And as we said, it's not experience. Personality matters, cognitive skills matter, but at the end of the day, what research tells us is that you have to have both, right? You have to have the right personality, you have to have the cognitive skills that are required, and then you're pretty close to future job performance. Unfortunately, there are no perfect systems, right? So what we're trying to do is we're trying to get much closer to a good match than just any other system. But I always say this to customers, you're not going to find a perfect system. It just doesn't exist.
I was doing a little bit of research before our call, and there's like 35 or 40 different kinds of assessments. You chose 3 specific kinds of assessments for Bryq. Why did you choose those? You know, first of all, you chose the Holland Code RACIC, right? Which is the realistic, investigative, artistic, social, enterprising, and conventional. You also chose a 16 personality factor model. And then lastly, you chose a 5-factor model. So let's start with the first one, the Holland Code RACIC. Why did you choose that one, and what specifically does that measure? I know I read off the 6 or 8, whatever it was. So tell me a little bit about that and why you chose to include that into your assessment.
You know what? That's a very good question.
I know. I asked it. I get said, people tell me that a lot.
You know what? You ask very good questions, Jeff.
Yeah.
It's not by chance. So here's the thing. What you mentioned are actually theories, right? And they're not per se assessments. But give me a second and I'll explain how this all builds on one another. We want to assess 2 things, the personality of the person and their cognitive skills. I'm doing little hands here. And for the cognitive skills, it's fairly easy, right? You take the basic skills, numerical, verbal, attention to detail, and problem solving. And there are a billion good ways, as long as you do it and it's calibrated and you have no bias in your assessment, you're going to be fine. The personality part is trickier. And most people have been exposed to 1 or more personality tests during their career, right? MBTI, DISC, you name it. From all those tests, we wanted to find one that's actually reliable and relevant. So the 16PF is the framework that we've based our assessment on. And it allows us to, A, get a very detailed inventory of one's personality. So we have 16 discrete dimensions. Think like, what is the dominance of this person? Are they more cooperative or are they more assertive? How flexible are they? Are they rigid or are they flexible? Are they warm with people or are they cold with people? Are they socially bold or are they more timid? These kind of dimensions. And the 16PF framework helps us understand how a person positions himself, right? What are the things that he likes doing? This is super important. Once we have this, we know about you. We know who Jeff is, right? But would Jeff make a good product manager or would Jeff make a good journalist? I wouldn't know just by looking at the personality. And it's too much to ask from HR people to figure out just from the personality who would be a good fit for what role. Remember, as an HR person, how many roles do you have to hire for? Tens, maybe even potentially hundreds, depending on the size of the company that you're at. And many of the roles, you just know them from the job description, right? You don't have the time to go and sit down with people and understand who's successful and who's not. So instead of saying, okay, let's go and survey 1,000 developers and let's create a composite developer profile. When you do that, you're starting with a sample that's from people who have been hired. And you know what the problem is with people who have been hired already? You already have the hiring bias built into your sample. So if I take 1,000 developers, I'm going to bet that I'm not going to find 51% of them being women, right? Why? Because there's a hiring bias totally for men, and you're not going to find 51% of developers being women. So you cannot use this. And a lot of the tools are doing the same mistake. They're going and they're surveying successful people, but they're already taking the bias that exists into the workplace and they're perpetuating it. And that's not the right way to go if you want to create a system that removes bias. So what we're doing instead is we're going back to theory. And the Holland Codes is a theory about occupations, right? What Mr. Holland did, and that dates back to the 1940s, if I remember well, is that he looked at all the occupations out there and he said, you know what? Whatever people do, it ends up being one of 6 different major groups. It's going to be something that's realistic. People who work with their hands mostly, or with real items. It's going to be social, people who like to support others. It's going to be enterprising, people who like to go out there and get things done. It's going to be investigative, people who like to solve problems. It's going to be conventional. It's people who like to do things like project management, right? Who like to do from A to B. Or it's going to be artistic. Last, but that's definitely not least, people who need to, go out, do abstract and come up with new and interesting things. So he created this theory that's used a lot for career counseling, and it's used by pretty much everyone. So one of my favorite sites, and I'm sure that a lot from your audience know it, is the ONET site. Have you visited it lately? If you go to the ONET site, which we use as a reference a lot, you go and you type whatever role, you're going to see that it tells you a bunch of information about the role. And one of the things that it tells you is the interest, which is actually the Holland codes that correspond to this role. This is a very widely accepted model. It has been tested for not quite 100 years yet, but closing to that. And it works. It has stood the test of time, and it can help us find people who are going to be the best matches for the role. So this is why we're using this as a matching model, right? We're not surveying people. We're saying, here's who the candidate is. Here's what you actually need. And then we needed a way to bridge that. And there was no direct bridge from the Holland codes to the 16PF. This is why we're using the big five, the ocean theory, as a theoretical bridge that helps us translate the needs from one model to the other. And at the end of the day, it helps us say that the Holland type of investigative actually means that this person needs to be a perfectionist, and he needs to be open to change, and he needs to be this and that. So it's just, we're using all these different theories. We're essentially unifying them in our tool in order to give you, as an HR person or as a hiring manager, the best results. It sounds complicated. It was a ton of research. It took us almost 2 years to figure out how to do this. But in reality, you no longer care. We've done the work for you. We've done the dirty work. Now you can just go ahead and use it like that.
Okay. So how does your site work then? You go in as a candidate and you take one assessment, two assessments. Is this like, like one assessment that I took was like 160 questions, took me an hour and a half, right? I don't have time to put, hundreds or even thousands of candidates through an hour and a half personality or cognitive or psychometric assessment. How long does it take to put your candidates through these types of assessments?
It was a major concern. How can we get the best quality of data in the minimum amount of time, right? And there's always a compromise there. If we would make for a longer assessment, we'd definitely have better data. If we would make for a shorter assessment, it would definitely be more fun to do, but it would have worse quality. I think we've struck a very good balance, and we have an assessment that takes 20 to 25 minutes. Okay. This is how much people need to complete, so it's not a huge onus on the candidate. In those 25 minutes, you get all 4 cognitive aspects and the personality. So it's one unified assessment. It's independent of the role. It's always the same basic assessment, right? We always take the same inventory of the person. We're saying, here's Jeff, here's how good his skills are, here's what his personality looks like. It doesn't matter what role you're applying for. And we've tried to make it very engaging because, nowadays, in many areas, it's a candidates market, right? And people have to attract candidates, and getting them to complete an assessment is not necessarily easy. That's why we created the chatbot assessment. So you go in and different personas come in, they kind of explain the problem that they want you to help you solve and give you these multiple choice questions. The questions are timed. This is both to keep the assessment short and to make sure that we don't have to ask overly difficult questions. So, difficult is either the subject matter or how fast you can solve it. We chose for the latter just because it's an easier overall product. And the assessment itself goes pretty fast. We see about 80 people who get an invitation starting the assessment. And from those, about 90% actually completed, which are pretty good rates. We're very happy with the completion rates. And we always have people grade us, right? We grade them, they grade us at the end. And we get pretty good reviews. People don't say it's fun, it's still an assessment, but they find it engaging for the most of it. We're actually, I wouldn't say rewarding, but yes, in a sense, we're rewarding candidates. We're giving them a summary version of the results. They have invested 20 to 25 minutes with us. They should get something back. So we're giving them just an overview of what are their strongest cognitive skills, what are the most pronounced personality traits, something that they can definitely use for themselves.
So you mentioned that there are certain places in the recruiting process that these types of assessments would be used. Would you put it top of funnel, middle of funnel, bottom of funnel? Where exactly would you put this? You don't want to put every candidate that or applicant that goes through, right? So where do you put this in the
We
funnel?
actually believe in top of funnel. So we
Okay.
want every candidate to go through it. And let me explain why. We started this by saying that, you open a position, you get a stack of resumes, 200, 300 usually, and then someone spends, what is the industry average nowadays? 7 seconds, probably, to review a resume.
Yeah.
This is not a
Somewhere
good
between three
decision,
and
right?
10.
Yeah. You know that companies are spending a ton of money, especially now, to attract talent, to make sure that the right talent walks into their door. And
What?
then
I
they
never
just,
heard that.
yeah, you see how much money goes on LinkedIn and the likes, right?
Yeah.
All those job boards, and it's becoming more and more challenging every day. So they're spending all that money, and then they throw back that money back out in 3 to 7 seconds.
Yeah.
It doesn't make sense, and especially because we discussed how resumes as a piece of information are flowed, right? So we want to do away with the resumes as the primary decision making process, the screening. And instead, what we're saying is you open a position, you get 500 resumes, 500 applicants, have them all take the assessment. 80% of those are going to take the assessment. That's a good enough sample. And by the way, if someone can't invest 20 minutes into your assessment process, are they really that interested? Would they even show up for an in-person interview? Remember that this works both ways, right? It saves time for the employer, but it saves time for the candidate as well. If I know that you're not going to be a good match and I can prevent that, I can stop you from coming in, then you're gaining because you're not spending time in a process that would never amount to anything. So the investor's 20
Well,
minutes.
Markellos, the problem that I have with a lot of these assessments is that once the candidate takes the assessment, um, from our previous conversation, you're saying that the assessment isn't going to change over time, right? The personality of that person, their cognitive skills and things like that, unless they have some kind of dramatic event where they have traumatic brain injury or something like that, overall, it's going to stay stable throughout most of their life,
Well,
right?
that's half correct. Personality stays mostly stable, and I'm sure
Okay.
that all the career coaches can tell you how much time and effort they're investing to change a single facet of one's personality, like say dominance. But cognitive skills you can actually train for, right?
Okay.
If I go and train for my numerical skills or my language skills, my English can definitely get better, right? If I
Right.
spend 6 months somewhere, I will do better next time.
My Greek, it doesn't exist. So
Yeah, there you go.
everybody has a flaw. Come on now. So, but my point was that let's say that I go on ABC organization company's website, I take the assessment. It's now in their ATS or CRM or HRIS system, wherever they want to store it. I don't care. But then I go over to XYZ organization and fill out their application. I got to go through a similar assessment or another assessment. So it's not portable. It's not owned by the candidate. They can't take it with them. It's housed in there. So what happens is a
I'm
lot
sure
of
you're talking
duplication there.
about other assessments, right? Because
Well, it could
our
be
main
your
premise,
assessment, right? I mean, I
our
assume
main
you have
premise was
more
that
than
it
one
is,
customer.
yeah, but it is portable. That's the point, right? The data
Okay.
belongs to the candidate. So if I take the assessment for company
Right, but that
ABC,
next company may not use the same assessment. And even if they do, they may not accept the results because you printed it out. I mean, they'd have to get it from a third party to be
for two companies that are using Bryq, we're actually solving this problem, right? If you
okay.
take the assessment with company ABC and then you go to XYZ, we're going to tell you, hey, we have your assessment on file. Shall we use it for XYZ? If the assessment is older than 6 months, we're going to ask you to retake it, right?
Yeah.
Just because after 6 months, things may have changed. But for the first 6 months, which is usually how long your usual career search
Yeah.
phase goes, you don't have to retake the assessment. You just have to say, yes, I want to share it with B, C, D, and D, and that's fine. There are many other assessments. What can I say? Everybody should be using Bryq.
That's how you solve that problem, right? All right. So the other issue that I had with these types of assessments were the actual cost, right? So if I were to push the former assessment company that I was working with, they were charging like $50 an assessment, which isn't that expensive, right? Per candidate goes in the door. But if I just spent $2 to $10 for their resume to get them into my database, now I got to spend $10 or $50 or $100 for an assessment on top of there. It just becomes cost prohibitive at some point in time. How does Bryq solve the cost issue for a candidate?
You're very correct. This was one of the things that struck us when we saw this, right? If you look today at the marketplace, 80% of the Fortune 500 is using assessments because they can afford to. But once you leave the Fortune 500 and you go to the enterprise, the upper SMB, or God forbid, the lower SMB, assessments there usually range in the 2 to 5% range because they're hard to use, they're very complex for the candidates, and they're super expensive. So we looked at this and I explained before how, hey, we want to be top of funnel. We want to help you find the right talent. And in order to do that, we cannot charge you per assessment, right? That would never make sense. If you have 500 candidates, at some point you'd say, I've seen enough. I don't care about anybody else. But
Hey, you're
maybe
talking about
candidate 501 would be the best, right?
right.
So
So that's
instead,
why
what we're doing,
most companies are putting it at least some kind of threshold. Say, look, you have to have these minimum skill set requirements before I'm going to go spend money on an additional assessment on your skills. So they'll either do it for a slate of 10, a slate of 5, a slate of 3, whatever, to kind of reduce some of those costs.
this is also why so many companies have hard time finding talent, right? Because they're not looking in the right places, because they're cutting out so many people who would potentially be excellent candidates for that. So what we're doing instead is we're saying,
Well, let's
we're going to
back
charge
that
you,
up. Why do you say that people are being cut out of the system?
because sometimes the prerequisites that we set, many times are job related, sometimes slightly arbitrary. Okay.
Right. So
And the
what you're
system,
saying is the recruiter or the process is biased in some way and therefore knocking candidates that may actually be qualified for the opportunity. Whereas if you were to assess it earlier on, it's an unbiased assessment. It's based on real life personality. These are scientifically proven. Whereas, if recruiter A, interviews a candidate and recruiter B interviews that same candidate, might get through on one and not on the other.
totally. And we just discussed the software developer issue before, right?
Yeah.
Candidates getting through in a software developer position, women have a much harder time, right? Just making the short list. But if you have an objective assessment, it doesn't matter what you are, right? Gender, ethnicity, age. We see a lot of ageism, increasingly so, in the workplace, right? I don't want to hire a developer who's 50 years old.
Hey,
There is.
I'm 51, so okay.
I'm short of 50, so I can still say that.
There you go.
The reason why this happens is that people have their internal biases, right? Sometimes
Yeah.
conscious, most of the time unconscious. So you lose all this talent. This could be the 50 years old, could be fantastic developer, right? How do you know? Again, going to the top of the funnel, like an ATS, we charge per position. So if you're hiring for 10 developers, you only need 10 positions. You're paying a monthly subscription, depending on how many open positions have, but it's very reasonable. It starts at $99 a month.
All
And
right,
then
so
you
you're
can
paying
assess
per requisition, not per candidate.
exactly.
Okay.
Much like probably your ATS is charging you, right?
No, they're usually charging for a number of users, so a user head count. So if you got 50 recruiters and all 50 people have access, you get a license for 50 recruiters.
Well, the licensing models out there, it's a jungle out there.
Yeah. There's also implementation fees and everything else. So you guys are charging on a more or less a per rec basis, if you will. I'm sure you've got some kind of volume discount going on. But you were saying that this is really for any size organization. Do you really mean that? I mean, is this for like a mom and pop, SMB type shop making $1 or $2 million a year for 5 or 10 assessments a year, or is there some
About
kind of threshold?
30% of our early customers are startups.
Oh,
And
wow.
these are
Okay.
startups that have, well, the term startup is
Yeah.
quite wide, but we have startups with 10 with 10 employees. We have startups with 150 employees. They're both startups. But at the end of the day, a lot of times, some of our most enthusiastic startup users are those that don't even have an HR function, right? And they're saying, I would have no idea where to start.
Right.
I get this pile of resumes and I have to spend my very precious time, which I should be investing in business development or whatever it is that I'm doing. And I don't even know how to properly evaluate them, right? Remember, HR people have training, have experience, have all these things. What does a startup guy have? Usually none of this. So
None.
it's an awesome tool for them because they can go in. It's going to help them narrow down the candidates. They still have to meet the candidates. They still have to look at them. It's going to give them plus and minuses. It's not such a system that's going to tell you, here's the guy you're going to hire, right? It's going to tell you from this group of 100 people that you gave me, here are the 10 that are the stronger candidates. And if you don't like any of the 10, look at number 11, look at number 12. But these are the guys more probable to be successful in what you're looking for. I cannot put in price of that. We're kind of like MasterCard, right? Priceless.
Yeah. Okay. So we have about 5 minutes left here. Getting back to what you were just saying, though, I know that I know what I'm looking for in a top candidate. The hiring manager knows what they're looking for in a top candidate. How do you kind of reconcile those two and say, look, this is what you should be looking for?
There are two main methods in what we do, in what our customers do, right? Many will just go and say, here's the profile that's in the system. Here's what the theory suggests would be a good sales manager, would be a good QA engineer. They're having a look and they're going to find that they agree with most of the items, right? They may go in and customize a couple of items where they say, okay, the theory usually says here are 8 things that are important out of the 16 in the personality. But you know what? Because we're a startup and this startup is like a family, we want everybody to be warm with people. We can't handle a jerk in here, right? If someone comes and he's openly hostile, he may be the best developer in the world. He's not going to work for us. So you can combine the job requirements with the actual company requirements. And this is also worth a lot, right? I don't just need a developer. I need a developer for my company. I don't just need a biz dev person. I need a biz dev person who's going to work in my setting. Right. This is one way that people do it, slightly customizing maybe 1 or 2 things, the existing profiles. Or sometimes people are going to say, hey, you know what? I have a very successful team of remote working accountants. This is the one instance where they say, this is exactly what I want. I want people tailored down in all dimensions to this thing, because I just want to replicate this and have more and more. Normally, we dissuade people from doing this because if you do this in a team, you're creating a monoculture, right? And the monoculture is never a good thing in a workplace. But if you're doing, for example, remote workers, then you can go and assess 5 or 10 of your existing good guys and then look at the results. And we'll help you build a profile and say, based on that sample, here's what it would look like for you. Remember that this sample includes all your hiring bias that you had today, right? But if you want to perpetuate that, there is a very easy way to do it.
Just cookie cutter it, right? Hire people that follow this model.
It works, but we're very cognizant when we're saying use this, right? Sometimes people say this role is so narrow and does just this thing. It makes absolute sense. If you have a team, we're always saying that the theoretical profiles are that much better. You need diversity. You're dealing with peoples. Unfortunately, you're not dealing with, or fortunately, you're not dealing with, I don't know, computers or anything like that, robots.
All right. Markellos, thank you so much. Very interesting conversation. I could literally, talk to you for hours. I already have. So on our previous conversation, supposed to last 15 minutes, I think we went to like 45 or close to an hour there, but in the after hours show, I want to kind of ask you a few other questions. The first one is, how do I know that these assessments are actually producing the results that I'm looking for in my hiring outcomes? And then the next one is, almost every one of the other assessments that I've looked at uses some kind of AI, machine learning, et cetera. And I want to know why your tool does not. Don't answer it right now. You're going to answer that on the after hours show. Markellos, thank you so much for being on the Speaker Agenda show.
It was a pleasure being on the Speaker Agenda.
All right, man. Thanks a lot. Everybody, stick around. We're going to go to the after hours show.